Hello internet users, and welcome back to another video. Once again, I'm going to be continuing my adventure into the world of Mega Man games, and this time, I'll be talking about the third one, Mega Man 3. Mega Man 3 is a pretty important entry for the series. After the surprising success of Mega Man 2, Capcom finally recognized just how valuable the Blue Bomber could be for them, and became much more interested in greenlighting another sequel. Releasing almost 2 years after 2, Mega Man 3 was also met with very positive critical reception, and just like its predecessor, would become one of the best-selling Mega Man games of all time, remaining near the top for decades despite the numerous amounts of sequels and spin-offs that would follow. In fact, several publications and websites, even nowadays, will still list it as one of the best of the NES's library. Odds are, if you were to search top NES games, there's a good chance you'll see this one on the list. And speaking from experience, since making my videos on the first 2 Mega Man games, I've lost count of how many times I've gotten a comment or message saying, wait till you get to the third one, it's the best. Although I've always heard that Mega Man 3 is a pretty beloved game, the more I get into this franchise, it starts to seem that opinions can get pretty divided on it. While it's not surprising to hear that kind of back and forth within big fan bases like this, there is something else that has me a little bit worried. You see, this game was forced to release before it was finished. According to former series producer Keiji Inafune, Mega Man 3 is his least favorite entry of the classic series due to its troubled development. By the time the project began, the director of the first 2 games, Akira Kitamura, had left his position at Capcom and exited the game industry altogether. In Inafune's own words, the new person in charge at the time just didn't get Mega Man like Kitamura did, which complicated the process. The exact details of what went wrong aren't fully known, but we do know a few vague things. Most notably, at some point, the game had even lost its main planner, leaving Inafune to fill the role himself, just to keep the project on track. It's also been stated that the final couple months of development were very disorganized, with just about everything running behind schedule. In the end, Capcom forced the game to release in a state that the team considered to be incomplete. Knowing this, I've been curious to see for myself just how the final product turned out. So let's get started and take a long look at Mega Man 3. The game opens up with no story whatsoever, apparently, just a very basic title screen. I don't want to seem nitpicky right off the bat, but this is a pretty noticeable downgrade from the previous game. Mega Man 2 is known for having one of the most iconic title screens of all time, so it's weird to see them go back to the bland one we got for Mega Man 1. What's also funny is that in the Japanese version, there's supposed to be a little picture of Mega Man on the side there, but the North American release just got rid of him for whatever reason. They didn't even bother to recenter the menu either. Since we're not going to be getting any story here, I'll summarize what's written in the game's instruction manuals. In the Japanese version, it's mentioned that Dr. Wily has become a good guy now, and is helping Dr. Light with his newest invention. The two of them are working together to create Gamma, a giant peacekeeping robot. But in order to complete it, they need 8 energy elements from 8 uncharted planets. To do this, Dr. Light and Dr. Wily create 8 robots together and send them to the planets to mine for the elements. However, something goes wrong, and the 8 robots go berserk, so now it's Mega Man's job to go to each planet and defeat them. The North American manual actually keeps the story the same this time, although now it's described through a communication that Dr. Light sends to Mega Man. It would have been cool to see some parts of this story make it into the game's intro, but I guess this is something that they weren't able to implement in time. Kind of a shame too, since the music here would have been perfect for another Mega Man 2 styled intro. I've heard from a lot of people that Mega Man 3 has a pretty great main theme, and they weren't wrong about that. I immediately recognized it as the Legacy Collection uses a remixed version for its own title screen. It's almost insulting how it pretty much has no time to build up before the title appears. You really have to let it sit there for a bit before this theme can even get going. But I think I've spent long enough here, so let's jump into the boss selection screen. The robot masters of this game are Needle Man, Snake Man, Magnet Man, Hard Man, Top Man, Shadow Man, Spark Man, and Gemini Man. Like with Mega Man 2, all 8 of these bosses were originally designed by fans, and are the winners of the boss design contest. For the select screen, they also managed to once again improve the presentation a bit. While the previous game introduced the popular layout we all recognize, Mega Man 3 is the first game in the series that puts Mega Man himself in the center. As well, his eyes will follow which boss you highlight. It's a nice little detail that I really appreciate. However, something that sticks out is that one part there, with the sprite flickering. That isn't just a glitch with the footage, that's there, all the time, in all the versions of the NES release, and is still present in the Legacy Collection version too. I'm really trying not to sound so pessimistic here with some of these details, but it really, really sticks out. By now, we mostly know the formula that Mega Man goes with. You can battle any of the 8 Robot Masters in any order, and will gain a unique weapon from one when they're beaten. In order to move on to the final parts of the game, all of these stages must be cleared. So with that said, let's get into talking about what new things Mega Man 3 brings to the table. Most noticeably, Mega Man now has the ability to slide, by pressing down and A together. By using it, you can move quite a bit faster and dodge some enemies you otherwise couldn't jump around. At first, it took me a little bit to get used to using it effectively, but it's definitely a welcome addition. There are a few things to keep in mind about it though. With how the slide is designed, you're gonna get frustrated if you try and mash the input all the time. Mega Man only slides a short distance when this is activated. You cannot just hold down the button for a long, continuous slide. With the right timing though, you can chain slides together for the same effect. If you press the button too early though, Mega Man will just jump out of it awkwardly. As well, if you bump into an enemy during this action, the game will still try to finish the slide after you take damage. So because of this, you can't immediately do a new slide after taking a hit. That may sound obvious, but when you first play this game, you're likely to impulsively input a slide when you get hit, thinking it's the quickest way to get away from the enemy. Next thing I want to talk about is the changes made to the E-Tank mechanic. E-Tanks are the items first introduced in Mega Man 2. When you collect them, you can later consume one on the pause menu in order to completely refill your health. Mega Man 3 has made these tanks even better than they were before. In the previous game, you could only carry a maximum of 4, and would lose all of them if you ran out of lives. But now, the limit has been increased and you will always keep them, even if you game over. The new limit for the tanks is 9, and that's way more than enough for an entire playthrough. Since game overs no longer take away your tanks, it's incredibly easy to keep farming them from the same locations over and over. When you run out of lives and reset a stage, all placed items will be reset as well, which includes the E-Tanks. This means that you can just hop into a stage, pick up the tank, and then intentionally game over so you can get it again. It's a little bit tedious to do, but there isn't any penalty for doing this. If you're having trouble with a stage or just want to have a few extra on backup, this is almost always an option. And if you want to skip doing that at the start, another thing you can do is just input the simplest password in video game history. If you go into the password screen and just put a single red dot in the upper right corner, you'll start a new game, with the only difference being that you'll have 9 E-Tanks. I learned about this after going through the game a few times. It's pretty funny how easy this is to do, you won't even need to write this down. But setting the password aside, the E-Tank mechanic of this game is so much more useful and forgiving than it was before. The changes to this alone already makes Mega Man 3 immensely easier than the previous 2 games. The next gameplay change I want to talk about is Rush the Dog. Rush is a new support character introduced in this game, and he allows you to use a few abilities that are separate from the Robot Master's weapons. At the beginning, you'll automatically start with the Rush Coil. This lets you call Rush into the stage and use him as a spring for higher jumps. You can gain 2 other Rush abilities as well from defeating 2 specific Robot Masters. If you defeat Shadow Man, you'll unlock the Rush Marine, which allows you to move freely in water, and once you beat Needle Man, you'll get the Rush Jet. This one lets you ride Rush through the air and make certain platforming sections incredibly easier. If it wasn't obvious, Rush is essentially the successor to the item mechanic from the last game. They pretty much just took items 1, 2, and 3 and turned them into a merchandisable sidekick. It's not a bad idea, and I think it's something that gives the series a bit more personality. I definitely prefer Rush over the blandly named items from Mega Man 2. However, despite this, I have a lot of issues with how the stages of this game make use of him. The 3 abilities themselves are alright, but I find that with the way the stages are designed, they're not that fun to use. Most of the time, I only felt like I needed to use Rush Coil because the game made it the only way to progress forward. Why even bother doing that? Instead of having me do any actual platforming, I just have to spend a couple seconds switching to the Rush Coil in the menu. This kinda just interrupts the flow of the game for no good reason. Along the way, you can sometimes use it to grab an extra item, but these opportunities feel so few and far between that the Rush Coil might as well not even have an energy cost to it. Usually, these out-of-reach items are only accessible accessible if you played the stages in a certain order, and happened to have the right ability at this point in the playthrough. But since you start with the Rush Coil, it doesn't even feel rewarding to go for these. I don't think the game does anything interesting with this ability, and if it wasn't for those mandatory parts, I'd probably just forget that the Rush Coil was even in the game. Moving on, now let's talk about the Rush Marine. You can use this in bodies of water to move around more freely. During the initial Robot Master stages, there is literally only one room where this can even be used. Gemini Man stage has a short section that can be made a little bit easier with this. I'm not really sure where people generally stand on it, but I didn't really care for this one. Since it drains through energy so fast, I didn't want to rely on it to get through Gemini Man stage, so I just learned how to reliably get through that section without it. As for the other screens that Rush Marine are used for, they're so short and easy without it that I can't even imagine bothering to switch to it there. It's like someone just told them to invent another ability for Rush and they just kinda threw it in last minute. The final Rush ability, though, is by far the most useful of them all. The Rush Jet is pretty much just used to skip over platforming sections. If you save your energy for really hard or annoying parts, then you pretty much get a free pass. The downside is that the energy for it drains incredibly fast, so you have to be careful with how often you use it. Or rather, that would have been the case if the devs didn't overlook something incredibly obvious. When you summon Rush, energy won't actually deplete unless you're standing on him. Makes sense, right? Well, the problem with that is that you can just continuously jump while riding. While you're in the air, the game cannot use any energy for the Rush Jet, even though it also follows your movement below you. Once you know about this, there is literally no reason to not take advantage of this whenever you can. You may not be able to make it last forever, but you can easily extend how far the bar of energy will last. This thing is about as overpowered as the Magnet Beam from Mega Man 1, and that's saying a lot. Another new thing in this game is the question mark tanks. Throughout the levels, you can find these placed around. When they're destroyed, they drop a random item. I guess they can be helpful if you get something you actually need, but a single random drop doesn't mean much when you can just farm the infinitely spawning enemies. I found that after the first playthrough, I tended to ignore them altogether, as they didn't seem worth going out of my way for. Now, so far, as I've gone over the gameplay editions of Mega Man 3, I've probably sounded more negative than positive in a lot of places. Like with Mega Man 2, I found that it's very easy to be critical of a lot of decisions here. They wanted to add some new things, but they clearly didn't have time to polish it all. I think the only thing this doesn't apply to is the slide. The developers clearly wanted to include this from the start. There are entire screens and enemies that can be more swiftly and easily dealt with if the player makes good use of the slide, and that's exactly how a new ability should be implemented. And while more modern 2D games have certainly made slides and dashes feel a lot smoother, at the time, Mega Man 3's slide was an impressive and uncommon thing to see. When it comes to this one aspect, I do think they did the best possible job they could, and I hope to see it explored more in later entries. Anyhow, moving on to another topic, the next thing I want to go over is the Robot Masters and their stages. These are another example of where Mega Man 3 improves the visuals yet again. While Mega Man 2 was a big step forward in this department, this one feels like a massive leap. There are so many more additional details in the backgrounds, making them look a lot less empty than before. In fact, the first time I played this game, it was actually pretty jarring to see Mega Man's sprite placed in front of a background like this. It almost looked like he wasn't even in the right game. That's how much of a first impression this made on me. Mega Man 1 was already pretty good visually compared to other NES games at the time, and it's cool to see how the series was able to keep up with that reputation as it went on. Here's a brief overview of the different Robot Master stages. Hardman stage has you entering and going through a mine, complete with construction-themed robots. Shadow Man stage has you falling down and going through a dark sewer system. Needle Man stage has you going through some sort of factory-type structure. I'm actually not entirely sure what this is supposed to be, but the city buildings in the background makes me think that they forgot that this was supposed to be an uncharted planet. Gemini Man stage is one that's a lot more fitting to the game's plot. You start crawling along the surface of the planet, and then you find yourself pushing through a cave that looks like something out of a Metroid game. Snake Man stage is very snake-themed. I don't know how else to really describe it. Sparkman stage is your basic factory area. It's alright, I guess, but it's not as memorable as the others in my opinion. Magnet Man also has a sort of factory stage, but this one on the other hand has magnet-themed obstacles. Finally, Top Man stage is something I can't easily summarize. There's a lot of glass surfaces with what looks like plants on the inside, and then there's a bunch of these mechanical looking things here and there, with a few animal themed robots around too. I get the impression that this level was originally intended for a character similar to Woodman or something, but that kind of boss didn't win the boss design contest, so they just kind of put Top Man here. Like I mentioned in the last video, the devs started working on the stages before they even received submissions for the contest, so it's not too surprising that some of them aren't exactly a perfect fit. I guess they did add some top-themed things to the level though, so that's as close as we're going to be getting for this one. Moving on from their stages, let's go over how the boss weapons are for this game. An important part of every Mega Man game is their bosses, and included with that is the abilities you earn by defeating them. I'm not going to beat around the bush with this one. I don't really like the boss weapons in this game, so get ready, because this segment is mostly going to be me explaining why that is. Let's start with Needleman's ability, the Needle Cannon. This is without a doubt the most useless ability I've seen so far in the series. It functions almost exactly like the standard Mega Buster. It fires shots in front of you, and you can only have up to 3 projectiles on screen at a time. It also seems to do just as much damage to most enemies as the Buster does too. The obvious difference here is that because it's a boss weapon, it requires energy to use. In that case though, what's the point of even using it when the Buster already has infinite uses? Of course, though, there are a few times in the game where a boss is weak to it, but that's kind of the bare minimum for Mega Man abilities. It needs to at least do a little more than that to stand out. Maybe there are more enemies that take extra damage from this attack, but after repeatedly trying to test it out in multiple playthroughs, I just got real sick of even trying. Trust me, the real reward for beating Needleman is always going to be the Rush Jet. The next useless weapon is the Spark Shock, which is earned by beating Sparkman. This fires out a projectile in front of you and can temporarily paralyze the enemies it hits. This might seem familiar because it's functionally the same as Iceman's weapon from Mega Man 1. However, for some reason, the Spark Shock was given a limitation that the Ice Slasher didn't have. When you paralyze an enemy, you cannot switch to a different weapon until it wears off. What's the point of paralyzing the enemy if you can't damage it in that state? If it's in your way, well, it's still going to be in your way. This bothers me because it's such an obvious thing that they already had an answer for 2 games ago. If this is how it works, then that means the only real use for it is to paralyze enemies while they're in a position that lets you safely go under them. But that's exactly what the slide is already for. Many of the enemies that you'd use the Spark Shock on are already designed to be slid under. Why would I even bother switching to this? There are a couple places you can maybe make use of it, but it's just not very good to me. It's another one that only really sees use in a couple boss rooms, because something has to have it as a weakness. The next ability is the Hard Knuckle, which you get from Hardman. This one is another projectile that's fired out in front of you, but this time it has a little delay before it moves. This delay makes it a slow attack that is difficult to land hits with. It almost could be useful, but for most enemies, you can just use multiple shots with the Buster and deal damage much faster than if you spent the time to switch and use it. I think they wanted it to be difficult to use to balance its potentially great damage, but the downsides aren't really worth it. When I can just hit things fast and effectively with the standard attack, something like this ends up feeling kinda pointless. Other than that, the Hard Knuckle does have a few uses near the end of the game. In the Wily Fortress, there are walls that can only be broken with it. It's pretty much the Crash Bomber walls from Mega Man 2, but this time they only have optional item pickups, and breaking them isn't mandatory to complete any stages. It's kind of strange that these walls were saved for the end of the game. Having them in the initial stages like in Mega Man 2 would have made the stage order feel a lot more meaningful. Because of this, there isn't any real incentive to beat Hardman early or late. For the first chunk of the game, the Hard Knuckle is just an underwhelming move that you won't be using much at all. The next ability is Shadow Man's, which is the Shadow Blade. I'm sure I'm not the first person to describe the Shadow Blade like this, but this one is a very watered-down version of the Metal Blades from Mega Man 2. Metal Blades were considered very overpowered in the last game. They had very little energy cost, could be thrown in 8 directions, and could easily kill most enemies. There was virtually no downside to try spamming them in a lot of places. The Shadow Blade, however, can only be thrown in 5 directions and is unable to be sent downward. It also has a much shorter range and boomerangs back to Mega Man when thrown. You also cannot throw more than 1 at a time. Now, compared to the last couple weapons I've shown, it has a bit more utility, especially since it can be thrown upward. However, all of these attempts to stop it from becoming the next Metal Blades make it feel a little bit slow, and just not as satisfying to use. I guess I would say that it's just alright. As I did more playthroughs, I did end up finding out about some more spots that it's handy to have, but at the end of the day, it's nothing too exciting. Next one I'm going to talk about is the top spin, which is received from Topman. Out of all the weapons in this game, this one has probably confused the most people. How it works is that when you press the attack button in the air, Mega Man will do a spin that can hurt enemies he comes into contact with. The problem with this one is that half the time you try experimenting with it, its energy cost seems to make no sense. If it kills an enemy in one hit, that's fine. But if you're using it against a boss or something, then you'll suddenly just drop a bunch of energy while you're still in contact, and it has invincibility frames. It seems like the move isn't even finished being programmed or something. Because of all that, the top spin is often dismissed by players for being a useless move, aside from when you're fighting Shadow Man, who has it as a weakness. However, I actually found that against some regular enemies, top spin can actually be one of the better abilities. Enemies like the monkey robots in Hardman stage can be defeated easily with it, and considering that they like to hang from the ceiling and jump around, it's the perfect attack for the situation. There are also these parachute enemies that are meant to be killed by it when you jump into them, though personally, I found it kind of risky and just prefer to pick them off safely with the Buster. With that said though, there aren't too many spots in the game where it gets a chance to shine. I would have liked to see them do a lot more with this one than any of the others. I guess I'm just gonna hope that they revisit the idea in a later game or something. Next ability is Magnet Missiles, which you get from Magnet Man. This is another one that I'd say is just okay. It fires an attack in front of you, and it will travel up or down if there's an enemy it can hit. You can safely hit plenty of different enemies with it that you couldn't with the Buster, and the energy cost feels pretty balanced. Next one I'll mention is the Gemini Laser, obtained after beating Gemini Man. This one fires a laser that bounces off of walls and can be used to hit some enemies in tricky spots. It might look fun to mess around with, but whenever you use it, the game lags horribly until it's gone. Of course, this becomes even more annoying when you miss with it, since you have to wait for it to disappear before you can fire another or switch to a different weapon. I don't really have much else to say about it. I think the footage really speaks for itself. Not a bad idea, but the game can't handle it very well, making it not so fun to use. Last weapon of Mega Man 3 is the Search Snake, which you receive for beating Snake Man. This one ended up being my favorite of the game. It sends out a projectile that will travel along the floor and wall until it hits something. It's decently fast, doesn't cost much energy, and is useful in a variety of situations. Like for example, when you're fighting the animal robots in Top Man stage, it's easier to focus on dodging projectiles because the Search Snake will make its way to them without you having to put much thought into aiming. I think a good Mega Man weapon is one that greatly changes how you approach a stage and is just plain fun to use. In my opinion, the Search Snake does exactly that, and is a nice little addition to this game. Those are my thoughts on Mega Man 3's weapons. There are some things I appreciate here, but I found most of these to either be bad or just underwhelming. Knowing that the game was rushed to release at the end, it can be assumed that the same thing as Mega Man 2 happened here, where they only had time to make sure they all functioned, and weren't able to balance and flesh them out. I think if they were to make some slight changes, like making Needle Cannon more effective against some enemies, or allowing more than one Shadow Blade at a time, this could have been a much stronger set of abilities to play around with. As they are now, the best use for most of them is just when they happen to be a boss's weakness, but like I said earlier, that's the bare minimum. Moving on, I think it's time I talked about Protoman. Mega Man 3 is where this character appears for the first time. He isn't mentioned in the story provided by the manual, and he just sort of appears throughout the game. In some of the Robot Master stages, he'll show up, blocking your path, and must be defeated before you can move on. His pattern's pretty simple, he just moves towards you and jumps up and down. All you have to do is slide under him and move to the other side of the screen. Two of the encounters are slightly different. In Gemini Man stage, he won't fight you, but will show up to destroy the entrance into the planet. And in Hard Man stage, the layout of the arena will be a bit elevated, making it a bit more annoying. It's kind of funny that they chose Hard Man stage for this, since Hard Knuckle is actually his weakness. This might actually be one of the few places you'd want to use this weapon, but you can't, because you have to get past Protoman here to get it. Not like it matters though, since there's usually a chunk of energy waiting for you after these encounters. And speaking of that, this is something that Mega Man 3 really likes to do. There is just free energy laying out in the open in so many spots. If you pick these up, they won't refresh until you run out of lives and restart the stage, but this game feels so generous about them, especially when you remember how much better the E-tanks are too. But I'm getting sidetracked here, back to Protoman. Before you enter the Wily stages of this game, he will appear for one final encounter in the center square, except here his name will be listed as Breakman. I guess I'm not supposed to know this guy as Protoman yet, but it's kind of hard not to. Even before I played a Mega Man game, I could recognize Protoman. This is a twist that just can't really be a twist anymore. Up until now, we're used to beating the 8 Robot Masters and then moving on to the Wily stages, but this time, Mega Man 3 does something a little different. When the bosses are defeated, 4 of the squares on the menu will display an ominous portrait, showing that you suddenly have 4 more levels to complete. These are known as the Dock Robot stages, and they're easily my least favorite part of the game. Let's go over why that is. These areas are remixed versions of the Sparkman, Needleman, Gemini Man, and Shadow Man stages, and within each one, you'll have to defeat 2 Dock Robots. The Dock Robots are bosses that have the abilities of the 8 Robot Masters of Mega Man 2. Whenever you enter their arena, a little animation will show you which one you'll be facing. Now on paper, I don't think the idea of this is that bad. The problem I have is that this entire section just kinda ends up feeling like padding. While these levels do have their own layouts that are different from the areas they're based on, it's not very exciting to jump into something that looks the same after you were expecting to move on to something new. At the very least, I'll give them credit for changing Needleman's area to take place at night, but that's pretty much the only real visual difference here. As for using the previous game's Robot Masters, I think that can either be a huge hit or miss, depending on how you look at it. On one hand, it gives some more boss variety and is a fun little throwback. But on the other, it can feel like it has the same issue of reusing things when you were hoping to see something new. And when it comes to actually playing these stages, a lot of people may find this to be a bit of a jump in difficulty. Most noticeably, the checkpoints here are suddenly a lot less forgiving. If you've played a Mega Man game, then you're probably used to dying to a boss and respawning inside that little hallway that's before the arena. However, here, if you get all the way to the first Dock Robot and die, you're going right back to the start of the level. Making things a bit more challenging is fine and all, but when you send the player that far back, you just create this awkward situation where if you have less than the amount of starting lives, you're just gonna jump into the instant death spikes until you game over and refresh them. There's no reason not to. Of course, the 8 Dock Robots now have new weaknesses, since you can't use their own weapons against them in this game. Some of them are easy to figure out, like using magnet missiles against Metal Man, but most of them are just a guessing game, which is another reason why this part's a bit annoying to get through. You're going through areas you've already seen, fighting bosses you've already seen, and have to go through the trial and error of testing what weapons can even damage them. Experimenting with damage works in the Mega Man formula because you're building up your list of weapons as you progress. You're making use of what you have, and even your stage order will make a significant difference. For the Dock Robots, though, you can't start this part without having all of your abilities unlocked, so it just feels like you're going down the list, checking all 8 of them, every time in this really tedious process. And you can definitely make a similar argument when it comes to the bosses in every Wily Fortress section, but here, instead of a few annoying boss rooms, it's 8 of them, across 4 long levels that really overstay their welcome. You don't get anything for clearing one of the stages either, as you don't move on until all of them are done, so there's almost no point to letting you choose the order they're played in. The only thing you can do with that, I guess, is to leave Needleman for last, since that one is really easy to farm E-tanks in if you need it. I found this part of the game to be a real chore to get through. Even after multiple playthroughs where I know exactly what I need to do and use, I've never had much fun with it. I wish they were able to do more with this idea, but to me, the Dock Robot section is just a bunch of reused assets to make the game feel a little longer. Anyhow, moving on, once these stages are done, the center square will light up, with Breakman appearing. Like I talked about earlier, this is just the last Protoman encounter. There isn't much to it, you're just dropped into an arena where you shoot him a few times with the Buster. After that, the game brings you into a cutscene. Dr. Light informs Mega Man that after receiving the last element, Dr. Wily has run off with Gamma. Surprise, surprise, it turns out that Dr. Wily was evil all along, and is behind all of the Berserk robots. Now it's up to Mega Man to infiltrate his fortress yet again, and stop his plans to use Gamma to take over the world. I have to say, it is nice to finally see a cutscene in these games. though this one would be pretty confusing if you didn't read the manual for context. Another reason they really should have had some kind of intro for this one. Also, I can't help but notice that they spelled Dr. Wily's name wrong. There's not supposed to be an E in there. Let's go over how the Wily stages are for Mega Man 3. This part of the game has essentially been reduced to a boss rush. There is still levels to go through here, but they're incredibly easy compared to the Doc robots. You're pretty much just running through a few simple rooms until you get to the boss. There are even plenty of E-tanks and energy refills here that you can't even miss. I don't think the fortress is very memorable this time. It's pretty generic looking, and it really is just Final Lab Area number 3. Outside of the bosses, there's hardly anything noteworthy to really talk about. One thing I can say though is that the map screen is complete nonsense. Like, look at it. Why is Wily listed as being in the sky? There isn't anything there. Not only that, do you see that one section that's outside the fortress? That level takes place entirely indoors. I'd say that only like the first level here actually reflects what this map shows. In this one, Mega Man starts at the bottom and enters through the sewer system. The first boss you'll come across is the Kamegoro Maker. It is one of the easiest bosses in the entire game. It just sends out these turtle robots that will bounce around, and you need to destroy 5 of them. The Shadow Blade does this very quickly, and because the arena is in water, it's easy to jump high and position yourself to attack. You don't even need to worry about the projectiles coming out of the walls and floor. All they do is push you around and are barely an obstacle. The second boss is the Yellow Devil Mark II. Returning from Mega Man 1, this guy can be just as annoying as before. The idea is still mostly the same. It'll break itself apart going from each side of the screen before opening its eye, leaving it vulnerable to an attack. This time, though, it has an additional method of breaking apart, where its pieces will bounce along the floor. I really don't like this move because the hitboxes do not feel right at all. The game clearly wants you to try and slide under these, but I can't for the life of me get that to work even once. Look at this moment right here. I'm gonna slow down the footage and show you all that I'm getting hit before the first piece even looks like it made contact with me. The only way I can dodge this is to just rush jet and go over it. The original Yellow Devil's infamous for being a brutally difficult boss that makes people give up. However, I found that fight pretty satisfying to learn and overcome. This new version, though, is just a really lame fight. Even if it is technically easier and faster to kill, to me, this is a big downgrade in every way possible. The third boss of the fortress is the Mega Man holograms. It's hard to call this a boss fight though, because I'll need to slow the footage so you don't blink and miss it. What's supposed to happen here is that 3 holograms of Mega Man will appear. One of these is the real one, and is the only one that'll take damage. They're supposed to be randomized, so you have to watch for the details that reveal which ones are fake. However, they mess this up, because the real one will always spawn at the top when the fight begins. Not only that, but they forgot to give this boss invincibility frames between hits, so you can defeat him in a matter of seconds, especially with the top spin or the search snake. Really not much else to say here. This is just another spot that shows they couldn't polish it all. The next section of the fortress takes you into the boss rematches. They figured this one out in the last game, and they set it up the same way here. The room is filled with teleporters that take you to an arena against each robot master. They can be fought in any order that you want, and all of them must be defeated to move on. If you don't have any E-tanks left by this point, then you'll have to make use of the single health drop that appears between each boss. Also, like the previous game, right after you're done with the rematches, you're thrown into a fight against the newest Dr. Wily machine. On the bright side, going here counts as a new level, so you don't have to do it all in one go like last time. Wily Machine 3 can be a little difficult to fight the first time you get to it, but can be made incredibly easy. For the first phase, you shoot the cannon with the spark shot, and for the second, instead of waiting for the machine to lower itself, you can just use Rush Jet and shoot until you win. But once this is done, the game pulls a fake out, revealing that this Dr. Wily was a fake. It's then that you finally get to head into the real final boss, Gamma. And it's a laughably easy fight. For the first phase, you just get up to a higher platform and fire a few hard knuckles at him. For the second, you just jump into it with the top spin. You win almost instantly. And if you somehow have trouble with it, there's even an E-tank at the start before you enter. With Gamma beaten, the fortress begins to collapse. At that moment, a mysterious figure arrives and saves Mega Man, but it's apparently too late for Dr. Wily. Mega Man is returned to Dr. Light, and it's revealed that it was Protoman that rescued him. We then get a scene of Mega Man running through a field, while being shown a list of the robots that Dr. Light has created. Or should I say, Dr. Wright, since they apparently couldn't get his name correct either. It goes through the bosses of Mega Man 1 before getting to Rollin' Mega Man, and then revealing that Protoman is robot number 0 and is Mega Man's brother. And that is the ending to Mega Man 3. But we're not done here yet. I've talked a lot about this game today, so much that this is now one of the longest videos I've ever made. There's a lot I like here, but as I've pointed out, there's a lot of instances where the game falls short due to the messy development. But what if I told you that there was a version of this game that sort of, makes it a little bit better? I've been waiting for a few videos to get to this, but it's time to briefly talk about the Rockman Complete Works releases. In 1999, Capcom released the first 6 Mega Man games onto the PS1 in Japan. These versions had some slight graphical updates and additional features, like an in-game hint system. Staying on the topic of Mega Man 3 specifically, let me go over what makes this the better way to play the game. First and most importantly, this version doesn't have all the slowdown and lag that the other versions do. I didn't get into it too much during this video, but there are a handful of areas where this game just cannot handle all the stuff it wants to have on screen. It's not so bad that it makes it unplayable or anything like that, but I definitely noticed that this happened a lot more frequently than it did in Mega Man 1 and 2. The glitchy effect on the boss select screen is also gone, so that's another plus. Another change that I like is how they made use of the extra buttons on the PlayStation controller. You can now use the LNR buttons to quickly swap between abilities, in addition to pausing and doing it through the menu like before. Having to open a menu constantly can really interrupt the action, so it's a nice option to have. The only downside to this is that once you get further into the game, you'll have so many of them that it becomes difficult to quickly switch to what you want. It's a feature that's fast and efficient in the beginning, but it gets slower as the game goes on. Kind of unfortunate, but it's still nice to be able to use it. As for other buttons, they made it so that circle works as a dedicated slide button. It's not really needed since the old input is fine enough, but I guess it made sense to put that somewhere. And that's pretty much all I can really say about this version. It's not exactly a mind-blowing upgrade, but it's cool that it's there, I suppose. Nowadays, the Legacy Collection is the easiest way to play these games, but you might have to go the extra mile for the Complete Works versions. I mentioned earlier that it was initially just released for Japan, but when the Mega Man Anniversary Collection was made, they actually used these PS1 ports when including Mega Man 1 to 6. So playing that collection is the only way to experience an official translation of these versions. Funnily enough, because of that, the Anniversary Collection ends up being the only place where they fixed the spelling mistake on Dr. Wily and Dr. Light's names. Another way to play some of these ports is to download them on the PS3 or the PS Vita. They're completely untranslated, but on the North American PlayStation Store, you can buy 1 to 4 as PS1 classics. Apparently, they didn't care enough to release 5 and 6 this way. Kind of a shame, since apparently 4, 5, and 6 are the only ones that feature an arranged soundtrack here. I guess I'll get more into that once those videos happen, though. Anyways, that about covers everything I wanted to say about Mega Man 3. As I'm sure you can tell from this whole video, there was a lot of negative things I had to say about it. There's a lot of potential here, and I really wanted to like it more, but as I've said over and over, a lot of it was clearly rushed. I think I should be clear about something though. Despite all of that, I don't think Mega Man 3 is necessarily a terrible, broken mess of a game. My main issues with it is that I think it's a very, very underwhelming sequel. Taking some positive elements from the first 2 games and giving it a new set of bosses and coat of paint, of course it'll come out as something playable and mostly competent. When I said that many people consider this game to be a highlight within the NES's library, I don't think they're wrong at all. For the time it released, I can see how it definitely stood out, and I'm sure many people were satisfied with it. However, from the perspective of someone that didn't grow up with these games and is making my way through them from the beginning, it just didn't blow me away. To me, the final product didn't feel like the next Mega Man. It's more like this game was just more Mega Man, if that makes any sense. It's so clear that the devs wanted to do a lot more with this game, but it just didn't work out that way. It feels like every time I find something I like about it, I have to follow that statement up with, however, it's got some issues. This weapon seems fun, however, there aren't a lot of enemies to really use it on. This boss fight seems like a cool concept, however, they forgot to give it invincibility frames. Mega Man 3 has a lot of good ideas, however, they only had 2 months to finish half the game. My name is Pikasprey, and thanks for watching. Hey everybody, thanks for watching the video. I've actually been working on this one on and off for like half a year now. Had a lot of stuff happen that kind of just set me back on this one. Hopefully you'll be seeing some more soon. Anyhow, thanks again, have a good night, bye-bye.